back for a Q&A, you can ask him what happens at the end of the book. I think I'd rather have you buy the book. Next, our next reader is H. Claire Taylor. She is the author of the Jessica Christ series, a comedy about the life of God's only begotten daughter. She has also published over 24 novels under various pen names. When she's not writing, you can find her buried in a book, thinking deeply about ghosts and soaking up the Texas sun. Wow. Not today.
It's a ghost day.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for coming. This is about 3 or 4 times the turnout I expected. So y'all are awesome. So yeah, this is the first book of my Jessica Christ series. I wrote this one about 3 years ago. I should probably finish the damn thing. But trying to set up where I'm going to jump in. I didn't want to jump in right at the beginning because you can read that on your own. I want to do something fun. My husband talked me out of the section with the most cursing, so we will go to this one. So to set it up, we have Jessica, who is God's, biological daughter, not like daughters, and we're all his sons and daughters. And she has been convinced by the charlatan Jimmy Dean to go to his church that he's founded. So she and her mother, Destiny, are going to White Light Church. So they have just showed up prior to this. They are walking into the church. They don't really know much about it. They haven't really learned much about it, other than the fact that they know that Jessica is somehow central to the scripture. All right, let's see. All right, traffic bottlenecked through the doors leading into the sanctuary. But once they were through, Jess was finally able to take in the sheer size of the place. Destiny pulled her to the side and out of the traffic while they assessed where they should sit. And it allowed Jessica a moment to work out some quick multiplication. She counted heads in one of the packed pews, 12. She counted the number of pews per row, 20. She counted the number of rows, 4. 12 times 20 was obviously 240, then times 4. 960 people could fit in the pews. Why in her father's name would 960 people want to listen to anything Jimmy had to say? Before she was able to answer her own question, her mother's voice interrupted her thoughts. Oh, Christ. Destiny stared straight ahead at the altar. What? Jess couldn't see over the heads of the group in front of them. What is it? Nothing. Destiny dragged her back into the flow of people before quickly pulling her into one of the pews farthest from the stage. Let's just grab a seat and get this over with. But before they could scoot more than a foot away from the aisle, a familiar voice boomed over the crowd, stopping Destiny in her tracks. Could it be? It had the omnipresence of God's voice, but based upon her mother's reaction to it, Jess was pretty sure it wasn't in her own mind. Destiny's shoulders slumped, and that's when it clicked. The voice was coming through the giant white speakers hung up around the ceiling. Are my eyes deceiving me? The voice said again, except this time she heard the man himself more clearly than the speakers. Destiny turned towards the voice. No, Jimmy, they're not. Reverend Dean didn't have to snake through the crowds like Destiny and Jess had. Instead, the crowds parted for him so that he was able to easily glide over to where they stood at the end of the pews. He looked much less like a salesman now, having exchanged his usual charcoal gray suit for one that was as white as everything else in this church. Even the headset he wore, hooked over his dome, curving down to hover an inch from his mouth so that not a single crucial word of his went unheard by all, was entirely white. The only exception to his uniform attire was the red cord draped around his neck that hung down his front and had cloven hoof dangling on each end. Onlookers watched in awe as Jimmy directly addressed the newcomers. I am so excited that you were able to make it today for this joyous anniversary. He placed his hands on Destiny's shoulders and smiled kindly at her. You are an honored guest. Then he turned to Jessica, who wished she had dressed in all white so that she could blend in with the walls and pews and floors, and perhaps escape notice completely. Child, he bit his lip and his nostrils flared like he might cry. She really, really hoped he would not. Words cannot describe what seeing you here on this monumentous occasion stirs within me. You are a beautiful child of God. While Jessica's brain scrambled to reconcile Ice Cream Jimmy with whoever the heck this guy was, Destiny's resolve gave out, and she rolled her eyes. Well, she is the child of God, so, ha! Jimmy patted Destiny's shoulder. Good one. If you'll excuse me, I need to start the service. He breezed past them, and the sea of parishioners parted to allow him easy passage up to the stage. As he approached it, the crowd took the hint and quickly filled into the pews. It wasn't until those in the rows ahead of her sat that Jess was finally able to get a good glimpse of the altar. 2 long windows ran behind it, letting light stream in from the outside, reflecting off of all the white surfaces on the stage where Jimmy took his place. It seemed like an awfully big stage for one man. There was one object in particular that stood out against the blank palette, and Jess had to squint to be sure it was what she thought it was. But no, sure enough, it was exactly what she thought it was. On the wall, between the 2 windows, just visible above where Jimmy Dean stood on the pulpit, was a giant mounted hog's head. And now Jimmy's pig questions started to gain context, though they were still far from making any real sense in her mind. She tugged on Destiny's dress. Why is that up there? Destiny grabbed Jess and made her sit, since most everyone else was by now. I couldn't tell you, she whispered, but I bet we'll find out. Jimmy adjusted his headset minutely before beginning. Welcome. He outstretched his arms to the congregation and let the word resonate through the large space until a small echo repeated his welcome from the opposite side of the room. I am so pleased that each and every one of you could make it on this very special day. As some of you may be aware, today is White Light Church's 10th anniversary. He motioned with a wafting of his hands for the audience to cheer, and cheer they did. Although she'd never been to church, Jess naturally assumed there would be less cheering in it. She let her eyes wash over the heads of the congregation until she spotted 4 familiar heads just a few rows forward and to the left. The worsts. It wasn't as if she hadn't expected to see them here, but that didn't make her any happier about it. A small part of her had held out hope that this would be the Sunday that they all got the stomach flu and had to stay home. Yes, 10 years ago, we held our first service to worship the Dios Aper. And some like to think of him, myself included. He chuckled and smiled, and the audience returned the favor. Why are they laughing? Jess whispered to her mother. One of Destiny's eyebrows was hitched up slightly, and she almost looked amused. It's called kiss and ass. Jimmy's posture softened, and he clasped his hands humbly in front of him and walked over to the stairs leading down from the tall stage. It was 11.5 years ago that God came to me. He took a seat on the top step and looked out over the crowd. He said that there was something important for me to do for him. None of this was news to Jess, so it still didn't fill the blanks of why Jimmy had started White Light Church. Many of you know the basics, but today I'm going to tell you the whole story, the hog's honest truth. He let that sink in, and if there was a noise level quieter than silence, the congregation had to cheat. You see, I was a sinner, a dirty, filthy sinner. I was fleeing those sins when God came to me on the open road. I was desperate. My car had crashed into a ditch. I had no money, no friends, and when I say Dios Aper, when I say that we are all pigs, but God is a hog, I mean it. His honey-smooth voice cracked before he placed a hand over his heart and bit his lip like he might be about to cry again. He created us in his image, sure, but look what we've amounted to. So when God spoke to me, he stood up and stared the 4th wall right in the eyes. He chose the most deplorable animal in this state, the scourge on our environment that does nothing but eat, mate, and fight, as his vessel for his word. Why? Because he knew that's what I'd become, what we've all become. And in his infinite mercy and grace, He was willing to degrade himself to this lowly form to ensure that we heard and understood his message. His voice had grown louder, and Jess felt like she was being scolded, but she didn't know what she'd done. And I heard him, all right. Blood of the hog, how I heard him. His voice shook. Was he about to cry? Why was he about to cry? None of this made much sense. We are a bunch of pigs. He didn't tell me this, no. He showed me this. In his infinite wisdom, he navigated me to the home of Destiny herself. And when I say Destiny, I mean exactly what you think. Inside that house, I could hear the blasphemy spewing from the mouth of a sow, birth in her piglet. What the fuck? Destiny whispered sharply. And when I knocked on the door, you know what greeted me? He paused for dramatic effect, allowing each member to imagine what swine-related horror could have possibly loomed. A shotgun barrel to the chest. He mimed, lowering the shotgun at the audience, lining up the sights, finger on the trigger. Then he lowered the imaginary gun, frowned, and shook his head. This was how the messenger of God was greeted by one of his creations. This is what we've come to. And now, just as an aside, I'm going to be voicing God. What I miss? I'm honestly not sure. Why are you asking me? You're God. Of course I am. It's called manners. No one likes to know it all. Hush, I'm trying to listen. Whoa. What? That's my head up there. Or it was for an evening. No, he decided to mount it like a hunting trophy. How did you not know that? Aren't you supposed to be everywhere at once? Think about what you just said. That's impossible. But how do you manage everything all over the world at once? It's called multitasking. Is that not the same? Of course not. Just shook her head to regain control so that she could continue focusing on Jimmy. When I finally told the old woman with the gun that I came in the name of the Lord, she could see the power that emanated from my person. And even a sinful, slop-eating pig like her could tell that she was no match for me when I had his word behind me. That doesn't sound like Granny. Well, the gun does. Don't worry, he's completely full of shit. Except for the gun, that part is true. The old hag let me through, and that's when I saw the truth of God's message. Before me was a woman on all fours, an unwed mother, grunting and cursing, bringing another sinner into this world. And it became so clear to me just how far we haven't come since God put us on this earth. We're still such vile beasts. Maybe we didn't used to be, but now, in this age of science and technology and philosophy, we're no better than pigs. Sumus omnis porcos, we are all pigs. Said Dios est aper, but God is the hog. Me, damn it. Is that really how it went down the night I was born? I mean, basically it is, but he has the meaning wrong. Why did you come to him as a hog? Because no one swerves for deer. While she wasn't quite sure how swerving played into it, she now understood that Jimmy was a two-faced liar. Either that, or Ice Cream Jimmy really did have a brother who looked just like him and pretended to be a reverend. Jimmy lifted his arms towards the congregation. And as we rolleth in our own filth, let us not forget who it was that maketh this same filth. And in unison the congregation replied, It was us who maketh this filth that we now rolleth in like good little piggies, but sinners all. Jess's head jerked around to look at the other woman sitting next to her, who had just spoken along with the rest of the room. How did they all know what to say? What did any of it even mean? And then Jamie responded with, And as we are all pigs, God is a hog. And then the congregation replied, Lord, I offer my heart as your slop bucket, if it so pleases you to fill. Hard pass on that. Jimmy waited until the echo from the crowd's incomprehensible words faded, and then he nodded solemnly and steepled his fingers over his mouth for a moment before speaking again. Now, the child that was born that night, the embodiment of our original sin, was a little baby girl. And as an aside behind his hand, he added, naturally, and winked at the crowd, who laughed. Why are they laughing? There was some sloppy translation work a while back, and don't worry about it. What's original sin? It was a terrible idea is what it was. I was bored. It's hard not to be when you control everything. Oh, this doesn't sound good. It's really not. I thought I'd spice things up with some conflict, so I gave up a little control and created imperfection. Things have been spiraling downward ever since. So that's what original sin is, imperfection? Basically, but it's more like original mistake, and one I've been trying to fix for, ever. Is that why there are so many earthquakes in Asia? Bingo! And am I the embodiment of original mistake? No. Well, kind of, but everyone is. Our all-powerful God had given me all the signs I needed to understand him, because he knows that our poor, animalistic, hubristic brains will only listen to wisdom if we feel like we've thought of it ourselves. Are you really all-powerful? See, translation. It was supposed to be powerful and all that, not all-powerful.